Hi, my name is Irena Swanson and this is part one of a two-part series on making LeMoyne star blocks very fast and accurately using my tube piecing method. We will make blocks of size across 12.5 inches, standard size, and we will make 6 of them in quarters in this first part. In the second part, they'll be in eighths. To make 6 blocks, we have to make 24 quarters, and these will be made with 55 seams total. That's amazing. With traditional method, you would need 120 seams. But the 55 seams that we need for 24 blocks like this, also at the same time create 12 of these quarters, 8 of these almost full quarters, they have corners chopped up, and 8 of these eighths over here. That's really amazing. So let's get started on these blocks. So this is using tube piecing. So for tube piecing, you cut strips from selvage to selvage for greatest efficiency of fabric. And for LeMoyne star rays, you will need 3/4 of a yard of each of these two fabrics. You'll need 5/8 for each one of these fabrics. And for the background fabrics, for the same for both, you need 2 1/8 of a yard. For the LeMoyne star fabrics, you need to cut 4 strips of each color at width 5 inches from selvage to selvage. For these rays, you have to cut them at width 3 3/4 of an inch. And then for the background fabrics, in the LeMoyne stars, you need 3 3/8 of an inch. And for background fabrics here, you need to cut them at width 4 5/8 of an inch. It may be hard to remember all these strip numbers, and to not get confused, what I do is I take a post-it note and I stick it here so to make sure that when I cut exactly the number that I have. So anyway, with these measurements, first I'll be making tubes for the LeMoyne star blocks. And so here are the purples on the left and the greens on the right. And the left fabrics have to be arranged so that they slant down at 45 degrees this way. And for the other fabrics, it's still 45 degrees, but the slant is the other way. And at this point, this doesn't have to be all that precise, but an easy way of accomplishing the correct slant is that for each of these fabrics, you take the width of this fabric, the cutting width, subtract 1/2 inch from that, and that's the mark where the next fabric has to start. So take this width minus 1/2, go down here, and that's where the next fabric starts. Right. After you sew these together, press all the seam allowances in the same direction. It doesn't matter which way, but they all to the left or all to the right. Once you have that, then you need to make an accurate 45-degree cut. And I already did it at the other end over here. I made an accurate 45 degrees. This really should be accurate. Okay. And then the next step is, we don't have tubes, but we create tubes. You want to sew this edge to that edge. So I'm doing it backwards for you. The seam will be straight because the edges are straight, but there will be a little bit of twisting in the tube. Make sure that over here everything lines up perfectly. Where the seam goes, that's where the two fabrics come together in a V. Anyway, once you sew this into tubes, you get tubes, but before you make those tubes, here is the construction for the remaining blocks that I call them. These will be co-stars. They're really spectacular. So again, the left side slants this way, the right side slants the other way. Also here, press seam allowances in any which way, but all to one side. And you get, once you sew the outer seams together, you get tubes. Here are parts of the tubes. These are the primary white tubes. primary because they are the first tubes that appear here. And then these primary wide tubes get cut into primary narrow tubes. And for the co-star blocks, the width of these primary narrow tubes is 4 3/8. So I cut 4 3/8 here and here. And depending on the width of your fabric, if for standard size, you will get 6 of them from here and 6 of them from the other one. And so that's where 6 stars come from. For the tubes that we get for the LeMoyne star blocks, you can get many more tubes, but you only need 6 of them. So here is one, and here's my other one, completely cut apart. I didn't need to cut all of them, but I did. And here you're also seeing that there is a little bit of waste here, which I will use up in some beautiful leftover project. Now you take samples from each one of these tubes. Okay, so and now it's time to start combining them. In the center, you position the two tubes for the LeMoyne star blocks, and on the outside you put the tubes for the co-star blocks. You also want to make sure that in these 2 tubes all seam allowances are pressed up, so if they're not, just rotate around. So one or the other, they will be pressed all up, and the other 2, they're all pressed down. That will make the sewing in the next steps much easier. Then you want to, these 2 are, it's obvious how these 2 will get sewn together, but it's not so obvious how these get merged together. One thing to keep in mind, you want to be building these corridors or buffers, so keep that in mind. And you probably don't see, but on this fabric here, I made a notch 1 5/8 of an inch down. And at the bottom of this also 1 5/8 of an inch down. And so this is a mark that when you sew these 2 fabrics together, when you go to the sewing machine, the seam on this fabric gets matched precisely with the mark. So there will be 4 notches here. You sew these 2 together, and similarly, mirror image, you will sew these 2 together. So I marked, you can either mark 1 5/8 of an inch up here, or better, you mark 1 5/8 of an inch down on this fabric, and then because the seam allowances are going this way, I will go to the sewing machine, match these 2 together, and I can sew down this way where seam allowances are not fighting the feed the dogs. Alright, so this is maybe the hardest step, sewing, measuring of this 1 5/8, sewing these 2 together. So here is the 2 outside seams already put together, and now you want to sew these the 2 together. All right. So we had 6 narrow tubes of each one of these kinds, so we will get 6 products like this. All right. So I am already using 2 here, and the remaining 4 are in here. All right. So this is 4 of those tubes. Ideally, I would also sew the other 4 together. It's much more efficient if you have a wide, wider secondary tube. And then what you want to do is, so for demonstration purposes, I'll put this in a firm background. My priority is making LeMoyne star blocks. So about half an inch, I made the buffer wide enough. So you really need only a 1/4 of an inch below these points, or here I should say. But just to be safe, let's make a 1/2 inch buffer down there. And I still haven't pressed the tube. You don't want to. you might as well wait. You mark with a pencil that 1/2 inch here, and then once you have the mark, then you go cut one layer of the tube only along that line, and you would keep going across. I will not finish this because ideally I would have 6 of these units rather than 4. Okay. So once you cut this all the way across, you'll get a rectangle. And once you have a rectangle, then it is much easier to press the seam allowances. Again, press all seam allowances in one direction. Once you have a rectangle, then cut along all the other buffers. So you get four such rows. Here's only 1/2 of them. So imagine this was twice as long as what it is here. I already cut 2 of them apart. And then the next thing is cut 1/2 inch below these LeMoyne star points. Okay. So once you have all 4 rows, you start cutting into the rows. So here is an example of one of these rows, partially already cut out. So this part hasn't been cut out, but over here, my goal, my main attraction is LeMoyne star blocks. So the way I cut these, I take my square ruler and I have a mark here that's 2 3/4 inch up. I line up this diagonal and then I cut down here, and I repeat over here, and from each one of these rows I get 6 quarters like that, and since there are 4 rows, there'll be 24 quarters. And then I also start cutting the co-star quarters. So here is my greedy co-star quarter. Again, I use the same 2 3/4 mark notch. So here we are, and I cut here. All right, but then when I try to cut the neighbor, this co-star quarter took too much, so I cannot get a full quarter over here. That's why we get only partial quarters. And then moreover, at the very edge of the row, we don't get you don't get a full quarter, we only get an 1/8. So there are 8 of these 8s. Notice also that we have some slivers of waste, but it's better to cut this waste away, and then we don't have to deal with the extra seam allowance. Yeah. So in this way, you cut out 24 blocks like this, quarters like that, 12 like this, 8 and 8 of these. And then you combine them together and you have the blocks. Over here, I have a few samples that are smaller. So when you start with smaller stars, then you get more narrow tubes out of each wide tube, so you can create more stars. Here there are 7 LeMoyne stars, and then 7 leftover stars. Half of them have all the corners, half of them have none of the corners, and one has some corners and not the others. Okay. So in the second part of this 2-part series on making LeMoyne star blocks, I will show you another method of making them without creating also co-stars.